welcome my panel members to have a chat about that. And Chantel, we'll see you in a little bit. So hi everyone. Hi my panel. Thank you for coming in for this discussion today. So we're going to talk a little bit about how far we've come over the last 10 years when it comes to building a more equitable tech sector, and then try and lay out a few ideas for how we can sort of continue that work into the future. But before we start doing that, if I could ask you each to introduce yourselves briefly, starting with Gillian, if you don't mind.
Hi, I'm Gillian Arnold. I spent most of my life working for IBM in the UK, spent a little bit of time working for BT, a little bit for Citibank. I've been around and mostly in techie roles. But these days I teach diversity. I run a small diversity recruitment company, and I'm a VP at the British Computer Society.
Brilliant. And Russ?
Hi, everyone. I'm Russ. I'm the founder of Tech London Advocates and Global Tech Advocates. And we've been pretty active as an organization focusing on diversity and inclusion for a number of years. And a lot of that great work comes through working groups that we've set up, like our TLA Women in Tech, our TLA Black Women in Tech groups. We have a TLA Tech for Disabilities group and a TLA LGBTQ group. And they all look at this from various angles. So something that's kind of near and dear to my heart.
Fantastic. And Andrea?
Hi, I'm currently a consultant for Infosys, but I've spent a long time in tech with different companies, both here in the UK, Norway and India. I'm very passionate about gender equality and I'm currently the chair of BCS Women.
Perfect. Right, so jumping right in, and none of these are particularly easy questions really, but you guys have plenty of experience, so I'm sure you will be able to give us some very honest and helpful answers. Each of you have been involved in the tech sector for a long time, like you've all just described. I wanted to know what notable changes you've witnessed when it comes to diversity and inclusion in tech. What's going well, what isn't? Is it any different from when you first started in the sector? I'll throw it over to Russ first because he's nodding.
Thanks a lot, Claire. I guess broadly in answer to your question, yes, I've seen some positive changes. You know, we launched Tech London Advocates 8 years ago, and yes, one of the first groups that we set up was a TLA Women in Tech group with some amazing leaders. But I would say fast forward today, the good news is there's so much more awareness of the importance of this issue under the broad umbrella of diversity and inclusion. Many tech organizations, both large and small, have a chief D&I officer, for example. And I think having this focus and attention on this topic permeates most organizations. So that's a real plus. I think the frustration is, and I'd love to hear what Andrea and Gillian have to say. I don't think the needle has actually moved dramatically over the past 8 years in terms of the actual results. And I know I'm frustrated by that. I'm sure all of us are frustrated by that. And that says to me, are we not doing enough? Are we not doing the right things? Or is there something else that needs to be unlocked to really move this needle and make the fundamental shift that comes through in the results that says tech organizations are truly diverse across gender, across ethnicity, across sexual orientation and disability? And I don't think any of us could say that today.
Gillian?
Yeah, I'm with you, Russ. We haven't shifted the needle at all in the last 20 years. We've been stuck at between 16 and 17% women in tech, and it flip-flops. One year we do well or do well by 1 percentage point or part of a percentage point, and then we flip back. For me, the reason why it's not moving is it's because it's all of us. So primarily, and excuse me, Russ, but primarily it's the women's groups or groups who care about diversity who are doing it. And it's not the CIO in most cases, and it's not the head of architecture or the head of software development in most cases. And it needs to be. We need to encourage these people to feel that it's important for them to fix it, not just for us to fix it.
And I'm assuming by what you're saying, Gillian, that most of those roles are filled by white men. And that's part of the problem, which is they're not embracing this the way we need them to. Is that fair?
You're dead right. And so I think it was last year's statistics were 11% senior managers in tech. I don't know whether that's gone up this year, but you know, that's pathetic. So we need for allyship in the CIO male sector, really.
Agreed.
So starting with Andrea, we've had this mention of, you know, like it should be people who are higher up, who are predominantly white males, who should be helping to shift the dial. But what are we actually asking them to do?
Well, I think we all know that, well, maybe we don't know. I mean, maybe I'm making a big assumption here, that women don't apply for the same sorts of roles as men do. The way that we try and attract people into the industry is, you know, what works for a man doesn't necessarily work for a woman. And I think we need to look at different ways to attract, you know, what the packages are. You know, it's the whole thing is not. And the work-life balance is also incredibly important. And it's also looking at your teams, and you will have high-performing women within your teams, but they may not apply for the role because they think they can't do they can only do 75% of what's on the job spec. So think about what you're putting on a job spec, but also, you know, maybe suggest that they have the skill sets to go forward for it, because lots of people don't feel that they're capable of doing it, and so by encouraging them to apply, and even if you just get them to apply for the role and they may not be the right person for that thing, give them some feedback so that they actually know. Men generally ask for feedback, women don't. And so it's really important that you actually tell them, well, actually, if you do this next time, you're more likely, or you need to go and get this experience, and that will put you in really good stead for your next application.
And I think men need to really, men in these leadership roles really need to enable that. So, you know, part of the reason why I think the needle hasn't moved is I think a lot of these leaders don't assume or believe that this needs to be an integral part of how they lead their companies, that, you know, looking at D&I needs to be across everything, and it has to start at the top. And, you know, those organizations that maybe have had a better track record, I think if you look closely, you know, the leaders of those companies, you know, really try and drive that. They really walk the talk. But too many of these leaders who are white men, they'll talk the talk, but then they're going to delegate it down to their HR director or this particular person, and they don't engage with it. And, you know, except maybe every quarter, oh, how are we doing? How are the results coming along? Those leaders that make this an integral part of everything that they do, I think we'll see and reap the benefits of that over time. And that's where, you know, I feel like my role is, you know, I'm not a woman, I'm not from an ethnic minority, but I can talk to many of the white men, you know, who are leading these tech businesses and saying, what are you doing? What are you doing day in and day out to enable this change to happen in your organization? Because every person in your company is looking at you for the signals. And if you're not leading by example and demonstrating how you're doing this, and not just giving it lip service, but fundamentally driving that change, then it ain't going to happen. And I think the reality is, and, you know, we've been talking about these results, it's not happening because it's not happening at that level, except for a handful of companies and hopefully some enlightened white men who get it and see it as a competitive advantage, as the right thing to do, and creating a better organization that's building better products and services as a result. it's frustrating as hell. You can probably tell from my voice and from all of our voices, but that's where we've got to bang the drum. And I think women and men should be pointing the fingers at these leaders saying, it's down to you to make this happen.
I think people need to be held accountable
Absolutely.
and to, you know, and put it in their performance reviews and get, so it's measured, because we all know what's measured gets done, what doesn't. If it's not on there, people won't do it. You know, it's sad but true, unfortunately. And you know, when you've got a panel, when you're interviewing a set of candidates, make sure that you've got at least 50-50, and push back to your agencies and say, look, you know, we need some, you know, diverse candidates. It doesn't, you know, I'm not talking just about having women, but having a complete diverse group of people there to be interviewed. And then you've got more chance of actually hiring someone who will have a different way of thinking to you. And that may challenge you.
I wonder, though, whether those senior managers also need some kind of awareness of some fundamental truths that we would understand. So, you know, the chap who did the microaggressions, Chester Pierce, he said, look, there's all these different aspects to microaggressions, and one of them is a myth of meritocracy, because women have it harder. They have to work harder to prove that they are equal in value. And if you're a person of color, you have to work harder. And then if you're a Black woman, you have to work even harder. And you know, the Lean In organization and McKinsey only 2 days ago produced yet another report showing how difficult it is. And so consequently, we've got to educate those leaders about the myth of meritocracy. They run their businesses on best person for the job, but best person for the job isn't you if you just happen to be a woman and a Black or a Black woman, because it's harder for you to prove that you're good. And we so need to work on that, because like Andrea says, you know, we need to attract everybody, but then we need to keep them, and we need to see them progress and make it through to the senior roles.
And you know, we only have to look what's happened during the pandemic, where the majority of people who either were made redundant or left their organizations were women. You know, so we're actually, you know, I dread to look at the stats for this year or last year, that they're going to be significantly lower again, unfortunately.
Yeah, which, you know, these figures are unnerving. What do we do if someone leading an organization or a team says, I'm always going to hire the best person for the job, I just don't get that many women applying? What do you do about that? What do you say?
Push back to the agencies and say, I'm not going to interview anyone until you give me a diverse slate.
Absolutely. Try harder. You know, come on, you know, if you're in the top of the company, you've obviously done very well in your career. You know how to deal with significant challenges, and this is a challenge. So push back and say, get me a better list. Thank you very much.
And know that it's going to take some time, because there are fewer of them. And actually, you'll be poaching them from someone else, which is kind of shocking, because we kind of also need the input from the beginners and the starters in our profession. But know that it's going to take you some extra time to fill your list with women and people of color and people with disabilities. So yeah,
and hold up a mirror to your own organization and say, you know, if you're looking at the outside, yes, get a you know, a much better list. But if you're looking internally, what have you done within your organization to really nurture the diverse talent that you may already have in parts of your organization, to help them to move up, so that when you're looking to fill a post and looking for the best talent, you can look internally and say, you know, there's a woman in this part of the business, or there's this, you know, Black individual over here. Those are the people that you want to say, how do we get them to rise up and feel comfortable that you have great bench strength across your entire organization? So there's the external part of this, but there should be the internal focus that says, what are we doing to enable us to nurture and develop that diverse talent? Because people will be watching who progresses. I do hear a lot of stories from, for example, our TLA Black Women in Tech group, of the number of, Black women who may get a role in a tech startup that's largely white men. They've worked really hard to recruit them, and then there's nothing to retain them or get them motivated that this was the right move where that person can progress through the ranks. So you have to look at the whole equation here. And again, I go back to the leaders and the boards of these companies to say, what are you doing?
And to that point, Russ, monitoring your current environment, the people, and what opportunities they get, monitoring anything you can about your current staff, so that you can say, we can see that the women are not getting all the opportunities. They don't get access to work with the top customers or work on the most prestigious projects. And that is why they're not sticking around, or why they're not appearing to progress. And that's down to us to understand what a meritocracy really is.
And I think if you actually demonstrate what you're doing to help people progress within your organization, and you can show a career path of someone, both internally and externally, then it will help you attract people. If people see people going in at one level and only ever staying there because they've ticked a box to say, I've got a Black female in my team, and they don't go anywhere for 5 years, that's not career progression, and it's not real diversity. That's a tick box exercise and not actually dealing with the true thing. And then bringing them in and recruiting, a white man to go in above them is not the right way. And we've got a massive skill shortage here in the UK at the moment, and lots of people are not looking at the people, like the over 50s, for example, and reskilling them. They're going out and rehire. Well, that even just bringing in the youth isn't the answer. I mean, we need to help them. Don't get me wrong, as people have spoken about earlier, and Jacqueline said. But actually, what's really important is that it's across all age groups that we help them. The over 50s, tech wasn't anywhere like this when they started their careers. So we need to help them understand what they can do so that they can actually progress. And as their current roles become redundant, we can reskill them and not just put them out.
I think that's a great point, Andrea. And I also think, we're kind of at a point where we look at many of these companies where I think, Gillian, you said the number was something like 15% are women versus men. And I don't know what the ethnic diversity numbers are, but you kind of want to hope we get to a day where we're getting to that parity number on the executive teams, on the management boards. And I think when we get to that day, and I think it is a win, but sadly, I believe it's way far off. But when those companies really have diverse boards and management teams, that's when the power of these organizations is going to be really unleashed. Many years ago, I worked for a US financial services firm called Charles Schwab. And there were 8 people on the management team of the company reporting into the chief executive, Charles Schwab. 3 of the 8 were women. And, it wasn't 50-50, but what that did within the ranks, both for the women and the men, seeing that at that senior level, you had nearly 50-50 parity. And the way the company felt in terms of the ethos of how the women managed versus how the men managed was really, really fascinating. And they've had their challenges since then with markets ups and downs, but it was the one time in my career where I felt I worked in an organization that was almost there, and the dynamics that were starting to come through were really exciting. So I really hope one day many of these companies, and it's not just women and men, but you've got Blacks, you've got ethnic minorities, and you've got people with disabilities at that top table. Wow, what will that do? What will that unleash in terms of growth, innovation? That's where I think we should all be pushing towards. And it is going to be a long journey, but that to me is the next horizon that I think is incredibly exciting if we can collectively make that happen.
Before I ask the next question, I just want to say to our attendees, if you want to pop a question to the panel, enter it in the Q&A and we'll have a little look at that. But when you have these organizations that Russ has just mentioned, where there is starting to, the split of, you know, ethnic, ethnicity, gender, and other underrepresented groups is starting to equalize, how do you build the inclusion into those organizations to make sure that it works in a synergy? You know, you want everybody, you want to have the inclusion in place to make sure that those companies really are capable of unleashing this great power that diversity and inclusion can bring. So like, how do you build inclusion into an organization to keep people on board once you really have got, you know, like the representation that you've been looking for?
I'm with Russ. You start at the top, you educate the board, you get the board to recognize their own biases, to recognize, you know, micro behaviors that shift cultures. You get them to recognize how their processes need to support the kind of value of everybody in the team. And when you educate them, you don't stop, because I've seen so many instances of, oh, well, we've done the board, or we've done this set of managers, and that's not it. You've got to go right the way through. And, you know, someone in the House of Commons last year said, oh, unconscious bias training, it doesn't work. This is nonsense. It does work, but it has to be part of a big, long process. And you can't just do a one-off and say, oh, well, we trained them, that's it. They know it now. It's got to be a constant drip feed of, oh, this is the way the world is. And when you start to get debate within the organization about, oh, those are our biases, and that's the consequence, and these are the implications, and everybody's debating it, then you're growing together, and then you can make change. But it's not a one hit, and that's why people put unconscious bias training or implicit bias training, why they put it down, and they don't sustain it.
Are there standards for unconscious bias training? Because
not that I'm aware of.
Because really there should be some kind of, you know, like a measurement of whether or not the unconscious bias training being delivered can be actionable. I mean, like, you could, like, is there any training to actually make people aware of what their biases are, and then how to tackle that? Because sometimes it's just
we train that all the time, and there are some top institutions in the UK who do that. However, you know, no, there aren't any standards that I'm aware of. So that means that somebody could go and do an hour, and doing an hour is fine if it's part of a long program of education. So, you know, if you're doing an hour for a lunch and learn, but actually next month you're going to do something else which is on a similar theme, so that it's a continuous process, then yeah, the hour should be okay, as long as you've got a kind of reasonable practitioner. But it's just recognizing it can't be a one-hit wonder.
And I think, maybe building on your point, Gillian, you know, absolutely, that it starts at the top. It has to be driven from the top of the organization. I also think, and sadly, we probably don't have many examples of these, but I often think that there would also be organic change as the mix of organization changes. So if a management team has one woman, then moves to 3, and then maybe half the management team is represented by women, hopefully there are cultural changes that are also happening underneath, as long as they're also driving the D&I agenda that's hopefully emanating from the top. That's an assumption, but I'm going to assume that people would do that. But then people in the organization and those more traditional, you know, with folks with their biases, et cetera, may start to realize that the culture of that company is no longer right for them. And maybe they move on. And so you start to have more of an attraction to people who look at this culture by a diverse leadership team and say, that actually feels like a really good organization to be part of, versus those that just do it. And then you see, 15 men on the management team, and you just think, this ain't ever going to change anytime soon, unless they're all driving it through. So there are signals that people can look at, but I do think companies that are really trying and starting to move the needle culturally can also attract and make some of those organic changes in complement to what you were saying, Gillian, about driving it down from the top, that it's not just do a lunch with somebody and then forget about it. It has to be integral to everything that the organization does and tries to achieve.
And a question that I've seen that Gillian's just answered, so maybe directed at Andrea and Russ. When it comes to unconscious bias training, should it just be available to managers, or should it be available to everybody in the organization?
Everyone.
Everyone.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm glad I said everyone before. I could have been wrong.
Well, otherwise, you could have been like, well, actually, I disagree with the
No, but I think if you have somebody who's in a non-managerial position who desperately needs the training and is not getting it, they are going to create a negative environment around them if they're not getting something that they desperately need. And, I've worked in many organizations in my career, if bad behavior is allowed to fester, if you will, people then look at that and say, well, that person's getting away with it, so I don't need to worry about it. So I think you have to do it from top to bottom, and managers and non-managers alike should really go through something like this. And I think not everyone, but I think a lot of people who go through these trainings kind of come out of it thinking, oh my gosh, I didn't think I was, but I am. And that self-awareness, I think, is a really important aspect for any employee in any company.
But you also need to help people learn how to become less biased, because that equally is scary, is discovering that you are. We could talk about like white privilege. When you suddenly think about it like that, and you think, well, I'm not racist, so that's not the answer. There's a whole load of other layers that need to be addressed. So you can't just do one thing in isolation. It is lots of different things that you've got to do to support your teams.
But for any CIOs who are going, oh, well, how am I going to deal with all the cost of training all those people? It doesn't have to be that everybody has a one-day course, so you can do the appropriate level of education for people. So lunch and learns for some people, and longer sessions for managers and executives where they're thinking about how to apply it. And so it really doesn't, you can even do a teach the teachers and go off and do it yourself, as long as you quality control that in some way.
Yeah, I mean, you can give them a toolkit in which they can use, start a meeting with a diversity and inclusion and equity moment. So getting people to talk about it more, so that they feel comfortable. People in the past talked about health and safety moments, but actually talking about a DNI or DEI, whatever you want to call it. It depends which organization you're in, the order, but it's equally, by starting to talk about it, makes it normal, and people then feel comfortable discussing it, rather than going, oh, well, I'm not sure, don't want to get in trouble for talking about this.
Yeah.
To the very first point you asked, Claire, has anything changed? I think the thing that I do see changing is the huge uptake in training on this stuff, which is great, because there'll be a public awareness of some of the issues, but it takes time, and that organizational change thing takes time.
But hopefully not the 200 years that Jacqueline cited in her keynote. I have an audience question. Obviously, technology is part of everybody's lives and growing in importance every day. The audience question is, what are the consequences of having a lack of women building the technologies that we're all using?
consequence is having Alexa and Siri being shouted at, because it's enormous, isn't it? Sorry, Andrea.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I mean, there's a big thing, for me is, don't pink it and shrink it, and looking at computer games and things that there's loads of women play those on their phones, but they're not involved in it. But I think sometimes it's because people don't know what sort of careers are out there that they could actually, it's not always about coding. There are designs that they could do, do the graphics. It's all sorts of different things. They could be a project manager, they could be a scrum master. There's lots of different roles, but you've got to highlight what those roles are so that people know and think, oh yes, I can do that. But at the moment, people go, oh, tech, and that they run away from it because they're a bit scared. It's something they don't know. Go on, Gillian.
I was just thinking about the games, and I was thinking, the consequence is that all those gaming companies are not making as much money as they could be making if they were servicing the other half, or most of those women who don't play games.
Well, actually, I think that, to me, that's the massive point coming out of this, which is I think it spells disaster for these companies because they're missing so many potential market opportunities for the products that they're building if they're just built by white men. The gaming has been mentioned as an example of that, but I think there are many other examples where we're not building products that are relevant for the audiences that are out there if it's just built by one shrinking segment of the population. That, to me, and again, we come back to, it starts at the top. The boards of these companies, the CEOs, they should be hammering on this point because it ultimately leads to better growth, better profitability. The McKinsey reports, the KPMG reports, every year they come out with this. They always say more diverse companies are more profitable and more lucrative, and yet the lesson is still not being learned. There's still a disconnect there. But I also see this as an opportunity for those companies that can figure it out. I had the opportunity to meet the CTO of Slack. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago. And, he spoke about D&I, and he said, we were driving D&I, and he said, they really believed this when they were, I think, a 7 or 8 person company. And he said, I couldn't imagine putting in a D&I agenda after we were 200 employees, because just shifting that tanker is so difficult. But yet that's what many of these tech businesses are at risk of doing if they don't start from day one and build diverse organizations. And their investors behind these startups, they should be beating the drum, but they're part of the problem because we're not investing anywhere near enough in female founders and Black female founders. That is what's going to hold us back. So in a lot of these events and meetings where it's being discussed, which is great, but let's make the changes happen. And tech will thrive if we make that happen.
Yeah, otherwise we end up with things like the seatbelt that was designed by a man, which isn't fit for purpose.
Yep.
And there's a whole load of things. If anyone gets a chance to read Invisible Women by Caroline Perez, it's definitely worth a read. It's scary though.
Yeah. Brilliant. I think that's all the time that we have left. One final quick fire question for each of you. Are we going to be having the same conversation in another 10 years?
I hope not.
Russ?
Gillian?
I'm hesitating because part of me is thinking, we're still going to be talking about it. I hope not.
We are still going to be talking about this, sadly, but I'm optimistic that we will have more examples of companies that have figured out how to do this, that get others to wake up. Otherwise, they risk going out of business.
We can be optimistic also that this panel ends up being 2 men and a woman. And then, we know we're fixing it because it's not just the women doing all the work. And that would be really nice.
Men have to step up to this. I keep banging that drum. It's not going to move unless men get active in this. And just even, mentoring women, sitting down, coaching, whatever it is, get involved. There are male agents of change out there, but it's a short list of people.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And thank you to them all, but
Yeah.
more of you are needed.